Hello, my name is Olivia Snow, and for my midterm project this year for my humanities class, I chose to compare the works of both Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. Just to give a little comparison between the two artists, they were both two of the most influential artists of all time. They choose to portray the human body in a plethora of different ways, which I will get into the differences between those two as I further into the PowerPoint. Both artists projected certain messages through their artistic depictions. They were both fascinated by the human body, although, like I said, once I get farther into the PowerPoint, you'll learn how they both had their own ways of viewing the human body and studying it as well. They both studied the human body intensely through bodily dissections to better understand them. And they are both best known for their sculptures and paintings, specifically displaying the human body in their work. And that was like a huge focal point for both of them. That was pretty much, they painted pictures of people instead of like objects most of the time. On the contrary, a little bit about Leonardo da Vinci. He vastly preferred to display his work through the creation of both paintings and drawings. So he wasn't so much into sculptures as he was both paintings and drawings. Leonardo da Vinci had a goal in mind to create art as a way of seeking a greater meaning in the world. He figured that through creating his art, he'd be able to have some of the questions answered that he had about, things that went on in the world. Leonardo da Vinci was incredibly invested in drawing and painting the perfect representation of the human body in its form. Perfection was also a goal at mind for Da Vinci. That was like the ultimate goal, and I know for a lot of artists that's kind of what they look like, or that's what they look for, I'm sorry. But yeah, that was the main goal at mind for Da Vinci. He studied previous anatomists such as Galen and Hippocrates, and then dissecting his own human bodies. So he went from just studying certain anatomists dissecting human bodies to then dissecting them his own. Just a little bit more about Da Vinci. Although he was an artist at heart, many also saw him as a scientist. And the reason being for that was that he used anatomy not only to facilitate his art, but as a science as well. He used dissections to not only get a better look at the muscle structure and things useful to his artwork, muscle structure of the human body, of course, but he also used this as a tool to help him analyze the human body as a whole. Rather than exaggerating proportions to add a dramatic effect to his work, Da Vinci wanted to focus more on exactness and preciseness in his work, which is pretty much one of like the really big differences between Da Vinci and Michelangelo, was that Michelangelo, he used that dramatic effect to emphasize his work and certain points that he was trying to get across with his work, as I will talk about later in the PowerPoint. But yeah, Da Vinci, he was more just like straight to the point. He wanted to make sure that everything was perfect. Da Vinci also studied anatomy, which helped him to gain a larger and better understanding of the world as a whole, as I said prior, and art was a tool that aided him in doing so. Here's just one visual representation of Leonardo da Vinci. This is one of his most famous paintings. I'm sure many have heard or seen of it. It's the Mona Lisa. His famous Mona Lisa was created as a commission from Francesco del Giocondo, who is a wealthy Florentine silk merchant. And one thing I found really, really interesting actually was only the wealthy were said to have had their portrait painted, and they would only have one portrait painted in their entire life, and it was intended to be very much about social status and position as far as wealth. And then one more visual representation from Da Vinci is one of his other famous artworks, The Last Supper. It says Da Vinci composed this painting with the intentions of depicting both shock and horror of the 12 disciples upon learning that one amongst themselves was going to betray Jesus Christ. So this was a very religious-based painting. That's what he focused on. It was commissioned in 1494 by Ludovico Sforza, who was the Duke of Milan. So, you know, obviously wealthy people were the ones who commissioned artists such as Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo as well. And then I also have an audio representation. It's about 5 minutes long, so I wasn't going to play it on here, but anyone watching is more than free. It just describes the history and talents of Leonardo da Vinci and a few of his most known artworks that are discussed, along with conferring how he became such a well-known artist. And then we move on to Michelangelo. On the contrary to Da Vinci, Michelangelo was a sculptor at his roots, and he rarely preferred painting. So while Da Vinci preferred, you know, painting and drawing, Michelangelo was very much a sculptor. As opposed to Da Vinci using art to seek a better understanding of the world, Michelangelo's goal was to understand the meaning of art itself. So there wasn't questions as far as, you know, the world as a whole, just about art. His anatomical study revolved around using it to supplement his art. He was uninterested with what laid inside of the human body and how it functioned, as opposed to Da Vinci, which I thought was particularly interesting, just because if he's basing his art solely off of the human body and replicas of it, you would think that that would be like something that they were extremely interested in, you know, learning how the human body worked and how it functioned. But it actually says that Michelangelo's focal point was external anatomy, that being the muscles and the contours of the human body. So more so what was on the outside, whereas Da Vinci focused on what was on the inside. A little bit more about Michelangelo. He looked at the different forms of the human body and how the skeleton and underlying muscles contributed to both movement and appearance. Given this, he primarily focused on producing nude art, which again I found extremely interesting because, you know, I never thought about that until I went and looked at a lot of his famous pieces, and a lot of the people that he sculpted were nude in the pictures. It says, when looking at both artists' work, the differences are clear to see. Michelangelo regularly exaggerated perspective and size to give his art a larger meaning, as I was kind of saying before, whereas, you know, Da Vinci focused on preciseness and he focused on exaggeration of his art. It says, rather than having his art be a perfectly anatomically representative, his works differed based on which point he was trying to get across, which when I look into the visual representations that I will show, that's extremely prominent, that point in particular. It says, going back to how Michelangelo's proportions of his art differed depending on his message, this piece named Pieta is not perfectly proportioned. It says, in relation to Jesus Christ, Virgin Mary is abnormally large, especially since the Pieta depicts Jesus Christ after he had been crucified. And as you can see, if you watch this on YouTube, you can get a better look. She is extremely large compared to Jesus Christ himself, when normally one would think that he would have been bigger than Virgin Mary. One other visual representation, this piece, Michelangelo's David, was created in the year of 1504. He created this biblical piece named David, given he was a favored subject in the in the art of Florence. This piece was intended for great heights. The sculpture was meant to adorn the roofline of Florence's cathedral dome. So one could come to the conclusion that this structure is abnormally tall. And just another audio representation. It talks a little bit about who Michelangelo was more in depth. It says who he truly was is discussed a little bit more in depth. Here his background is provided, as well as his uprising and becoming one of the most famous artists to ever exist alongside Da Vinci. And this is my works cited. I have 4 different pieces, and I have the descriptions on just basically the summary of each source and what it talked about. And that is all that I have, but thank you guys so much for watching.